Tom Wade pushed open the heavy wooden door of Miller's Creek Saloon, the familiar creak announcing his arrival to the evening crowd. He moved slowly, his left leg dragging slightly behind him as he made his way to his usual corner table. The thick wooden cane in his right hand tapped against the worn floorboards with each careful step. At 45 years old, Tom carried himself with a quiet dignity that most folks in town had come to recognize over the past 6 months. The corner table offered him exactly what he needed: a clear view of the entire saloon, his back against the solid wall, and easy access to both the front door and the side exit that led to the kitchen. Old habits never really died, even in peaceful places like this small Montana town. Tom settled into his chair with a soft grunt, propping his cane against the table's edge, where he could reach it quickly if needed. "Evening," Tom called out Betty, the middle-aged waitress who had been working at Miller's Creek for nearly 20 years. Her voice carried the warmth that only came from genuine kindness. "The usual tonight?" Tom nodded with a slight smile, one of the few expressions most people ever saw across his weathered face. "Black coffee, please. Maybe some of that apple pie if you've still got any left." Betty returned his smile and headed toward the kitchen, her comfortable shoes squeaking slightly against the floor. She had stopped asking Tom about his day weeks ago, learning that he preferred to keep his conversations short and simple. There was something about the man that suggested he had seen enough of the world to last several lifetimes. The saloon buzzed with its typical Friday evening energy. 3 ranchers sat at the bar, their work boots still dusty from a long day in the fields. They spoke in low voices about cattle prices and the upcoming winter, occasionally glancing at the old television mounted in the corner where a baseball game played with the sound turned down. Near the window, the Peterson family enjoyed their weekly dinner out. Mom, Dad, and 2 young kids who couldn't sit still for more than 5 minutes at a time. Tom watched it all with eyes that seemed to take in every detail. He noticed how Jake Peterson kept one hand on his wallet whenever someone walked past their table. He saw how the ranchers positioned themselves so they could see who came through the front door. He observed the way Betty moved between tables, her body language reading the mood of each customer before she even reached them. Most people in Millerville thought Tom was just another broken veteran trying to find peace in a quiet place. They knew he had served in Afghanistan, though he never talked about it. They knew he walked with a limp and carried a cane, though he never complained about pain. They knew he lived alone in a small cabin about 3 miles outside town, though he never mentioned feeling lonely. What they didn't know was that Tom Wade had spent 20 years as one of the most feared and respected snipers in the United States, Marine Corps. His military file, locked away in classified archives, contained details that would have shocked the friendly folks of Millerville. 237 confirmed kills, 3 Purple Hearts, a Medal of Honor that he kept hidden in a shoebox under his bed, missions in places whose names couldn't be spoken aloud, against enemies who would have paid millions to know. Where he was now, the leg injury was real enough. An IED explosion outside Kandahar had torn through his left thigh, shattering bone and muscle, but the extent of his disability was carefully exaggerated. Tom had learned that people treated you differently when they saw you as harmless. They spoke more freely around you. They didn't see you as a threat, so they left you alone to live in peace. Betty returned with his coffee and a generous slice of apple pie, the crust still warm from the oven. "There you go, honey. Anything else you need tonight?" "This is perfect, thank you," Tom replied, wrapping his calloused hands around the warm ceramic mug. The coffee was strong and bitter, exactly how he liked it. He had developed a taste for harsh coffee during his years of military service, when comfort was a luxury that rarely presented itself. As he sipped his drink, Tom's trained ears picked up conversations from around the room. The ranchers were worried about rustlers who had been hitting farms to counties over. The Peterson kids were arguing about which movie to watch when they got home. An elderly couple near the fireplace discussed their grandson's upcoming wedding. Normal conversations. Normal concerns. Normal lives lived by normal people who had never had to take another person's life or watch friends die in foreign deserts. Tom envied them sometimes, though he would never admit it out loud. There was something beautiful about worrying over cattle prices instead of enemy sniper positions. The front door opened with another creak, and Tom's eyes automatically shifted to assess the newcomer. A young woman entered, probably in her mid-20s, with blonde hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She wore the uniform of the local diner down the street and looked exhausted from a long shift. She chose a small table near the bar and ordered a burger and fries, counting crumpled bills from her apron pocket. Tom found himself wondering about her story. Everyone had one, he had learned. The ranchers at the bar had probably inherited their land from fathers and grandfathers who had worked the same soil. The Peterson family was building memories that their children would carry for decades. The elderly couple by the fireplace had likely weathered more storms together than most people could imagine. His own story was different, darker, more complicated. Tom had volunteered for the Marines straight out of high school, driven by a desire to serve his country and see the world beyond the small farming community where he had grown up. He had been good at it, maybe too good. The military had recognized his natural ability with long-range weapons and shaped him into something that could eliminate threats from distances most people couldn't even see clearly. He had served with honor, followed orders, and brought his men home alive more often than not. But every mission had left its mark, adding weight to his shoulders and shadows to his dreams. By the time his 20-year commitment was complete, Tom had realized that he needed to find a different kind of life, one where his skills would never be needed again. Millerville had seemed like the perfect choice, small enough that everyone knew everyone, but not so small that a stranger would stand out forever. Close enough to a larger city that he could access medical care for his leg, but far enough away that his past wouldn't follow him. The people here were good folks who minded their own business and respected others, who did the same. Tom took another sip of his coffee and cut into the apple pie with his fork. The sweetness balanced perfectly with the bitter coffee, creating a combination that somehow tasted like contentment. Around him, the saloon continued its gentle rhythm of conversation and laughter. The kind of peaceful evening that he had once only dreamed about during long nights in hostile territory. He had no way of knowing that his peace was about to be shattered by 5 men who were, at that very moment, roaring down the highway toward Millerville on stolen motorcycles. Their hearts full of malice and their minds focused on the kind of easy money that came from terrorizing small towns full of helpless people. Tom finished his pie and signaled Betty for a refill on his coffee, completely unaware that the quiet life he had built for himself was about to collide with the violent world he thought he had left behind forever. The rumble started as a distant thunder, barely noticeable above the gentle hum of conversation in Miller's Creek Saloon. Tom's head lifted slightly from his coffee cup, his trained ears picking up the sound before anyone else in the room even noticed. The deep, throaty roar of motorcycle engines grew louder as it approached the town center, and Tom's body tensed in a way that hadn't happened in months. Outside, the sound of 5 powerful motorcycles filled the quiet evening air as they pulled into the gravel parking lot. The engines revved unnecessarily loud, a deliberate announcement that demanded attention. Casting long shadows across the lot were pickup trucks, and family cars sat peacefully. The Peterson family looked up from their dinner, confusion crossing their faces as the noise continued. Even Betty paused in her work, a coffee pot frozen halfway to a customer's cup as she listened to the aggressive rumbling outside. The engines cut off one by one, leaving an uncomfortable silence that felt heavier than the noise had been. Fingers unconsciously moved closer to his cane, muscle memory from 20 years of military service kicking in without conscious thought. He had heard motorcycles like these before in places where they usually meant trouble was about to walk. Through the door, heavy boots hit the gravel outside, accompanied by rough voices and harsh laughter. The sound grew closer to the saloon's entrance, and Tom found himself automatically cataloging the acoustics. 5 distinct sets of footsteps, he noted. Heavy men, probably wearing steel-toed boots, moving with the confident swagger of people who were used to getting their way through intimidation. The front door of Miller's Creek Saloon burst open with enough force to rattle the windows. 5 men in black leather jackets strutted through the entrance like they owned the place. The man leading them stood at least 6 feet 4 inches tall, with shoulders that barely fit through the doorframe. His beard was braided with small metal rings that caught the light and his arms were covered in tattoos that spoke of time spent in places where such artwork was a form of communication rather than decoration. This was Jake Morrison. Though most people who knew his reputation called him Viper, a nickname earned through years of striking fast and leaving destruction in his wake. His cold blue eyes swept across the saloon like a predator surveying a hunting ground, taking inventory of potential threats and easy targets. The four men behind him spread out instinctively, positioning themselves near the exits and corners of the room in a formation that spoke of practiced coordination. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees as the atmosphere shifted, from comfortable to threatening. The Peterson children moved closer to their parents without being told. The young waitress from the diner down the street suddenly found her burger very interesting. Keeping her eyes fixed on her plate, Viper's gaze swept across the room methodically, cataloging each person present. He noted the ranchers at the bar, working men with calloused hands who might put up a fight if pushed too far. He saw the family with children, easy targets who would comply quickly to protect their young ones. He observed the elderly couple by the fireplace, helpless, and probably carrying cash from their weekly trip to town. Then his eyes found Tom sitting quietly in the corner, and something like amusement flickered across his weathered face. Here was a man alone, obviously disabled, wearing clothes that suggested he wasn't struggling financially. The expensive watch on his wrist caught the light. His military bearing was still visible despite his attempt to blend in. Two Vipers. Experienced eye, Tom looked like someone who had once been formidable, but was now broken and harmless. Looks like we found ourselves a nice quiet place to wet our whistles. His three companions chuckled at his words, though there was no humor in the sound. These were men who had learned to find entertainment in other people's fear. Betty stepped forward with the kind of courage that came from 20 years of dealing with difficult customers, though her hands trembled slightly as she approached the group. "Good evening, gentlemen. Can I get you some menus? Or would you prefer to start with drinks?" Viper looked her up and down in a way that made her skin crawl, then smiled without warmth. He moved to the center of the room, commanding attention from every person present. "See, my friends and I have been riding hard all day, and we're a little short on cash. So we figured a nice little town like this might be willing to help us out." The meaning behind his words hung in the air like smoke. This wasn't a request for charity. It was the beginning of a shakedown. The ranchers exchanged glances there, bodies tensing as they prepared for trouble. Mr. Peterson put a protective arm around his wife's shoulders while motioning for his children to stay close. "Now, I know what you're all thinking," Viper continued, pacing slowly around the room like a teacher giving a lecture. "Folks just trying to enjoy their evening." He stopped walking and let his jacket fall open, revealing the handle of a large knife attached to his belt. The answer to that question depends entirely on how cooperative everyone decides to be. One of his companions, a thin man with greasy hair and nervous energy, pulled out a butterfly knife and began flipping it open and closed in a practiced rhythm. The metallic clicking sound filled the quiet room like a metronome counting down to violence. Another member of the group positioned himself near the bar, close enough to the ranchers to make his presence felt without being overtly threatening. Tom remained motionless in his corner, but his mind was working at full speed. He counted weapons. At least 3 knives visible, probably more concealed. He noted exit routes: front door now blocked, kitchen exit, behind the bar, emergency exit near the restrooms. He calculated distances and angles, his brain automatically falling into the tactical assessment. Patterns that had kept him alive in much more dangerous situations than this. The elderly couple by the fireplace began gathering their things, clearly hoping to leave before the situation escalated. Viper noticed their movement and shook his head with mock sadness. Now, folks. Nobody said anything about leaving." The threat in his voice was unmistakable. What had started as an evening of peaceful conversation and good food was rapidly transforming into something much darker. The saloon's warm, welcoming atmosphere was being poisoned by the presence of men who fed on fear and violence. Betty clutched her coffee pot tighter, her knuckles white with tension. The Peterson children pressed closer to their parents, sensing the danger even if they didn't fully understand it. their eyes fixed on the newcomers while their minds calculated odds and options. And in his corner, Tom Wade continued to sip his coffee and observe, his expression unchanged despite the adrenaline beginning to flow through his system. To everyone in the room, including the 5 dangerous men who had just invaded their peaceful evening, he appeared to be nothing more than a disabled veteran who posed no threat to anyone. None of them had any idea that they were looking at one of the most dangerous men who had ever walked the earth, a man whose patience and training were... Viper's cold eyes swept across the room one more time before settling on Tom's corner table. Something about the quiet man sitting alone had caught his attention from the moment he walked in. Maybe it was the way Tom held himself, still carrying traces of military bearing despite his obvious disability, or maybe it was the expensive watch glinting on his wrist, suggesting money that could be easily taken from someone who couldn't fight back. "You know what, boys?" Viper announced to his crew, his voice carrying across the now silent saloon. "I think we've been ignoring our friend over there in the corner." He pointed directly at Tom, who continued sipping his coffee as if nothing unusual was happening. The other patrons followed Viper's gaze, their hearts sinking as they realized the dangerous men had focused their attention on the disabled veteran. Betty clutched her coffee pot tighter, her maternal instincts wanting to protect Tom even though she had no idea how. The Peterson family huddled closer together, their children sensing the shift in the room's energy. Viper began walking toward Tom's table with the slow, deliberate pace of a predator circling wounded prey. His boots clicked against the wooden floor with each step, the sound echoing in the uncomfortable silence. The metal rings in his braided beard caught the light from the overhead lamps, giving his face an even more menacing appearance. "Well, well, well," Viper said as he reached Tom's table, looming over the seated man like a mountain of menace. "What do we have here?" It's like the local hero found himself a nice safe corner to hide in. His voice dripped with mock sympathy, the tone someone might use when talking to a child. Tom looked up slowly, his weathered face showing no emotion beyond mild curiosity. His hands remained steady around his coffee cup, and his breathing stayed calm and controlled. To everyone watching, he appeared completely unbothered by the massive man standing over him. "Evening," Tom said simply, his voice carrying the same quiet tone he used with everyone in town. He took another sip of his coffee and returned his attention to the cup, as if Viper was just another customer passing by his table. The dismissal infuriated Viper, who was used to immediate fear and respect from his victims. He grabbed the back of an empty chair and dragged it closer to Tom's table, the legs scraping loudly against the floor. The harsh sound made several people wince, but Tom didn't even flinch. "Oh, you're the polite type, huh?" Viper sneered, settling into the chair without being invited. "Let me guess, military man, right? I can always tell. You guys all have that same look, like you've seen some stuff." He leaned forward, invading Tom's personal space. "Problem is, whatever you saw over there broke you pretty good, didn't it?" Tom's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he continued to focus on his coffee. Years of military discipline had taught him the value of patience, especially when dealing with bullies who fed on reactions. He had encountered men like Viper before, in barracks, in combat zones, in the civilian world. They were all the same underneath. Cowards who used intimidation to mask their own weaknesses. "Cat got your tongue, soldier boy," Viper pressed, his voice growing louder. "Or maybe that explosion that messed up your leg scrambled your brains too?" He reached out and deliberately knocked Tom's cane away from the table, sending it clattering across the floor. The sound echoed through the saloon like a gunshot. Several people gasped at the cruel gesture. But Tom's expression remained unchanged. He simply glanced at where his cane had fallen, then returned his attention to Viper with the same calm demeanor he had maintained throughout the encounter. "That wasn't very nice," Tom said quietly, his voice carrying a subtle edge that most people missed. But Viper was too caught up in his own performance to notice the warning signs. "Nice." Viper laughed, a harsh sound that held no humor. "You think this is about being nice?" He stood up suddenly, his chair scraping backward. "Look around you, hero. This whole room is watching you get disrespected and you're just sitting there like a helpless old dog." The insult hit harder than Viper realized. Tom had spent months carefully building relationships with the people of Millerville, earning their quiet respect through his consistent kindness and reliability. Now, in front of these good people who had welcomed him into their community, he was being humiliated by a man who represented everything he had spent 20 years fighting against. "Can't even stand up for yourself, can you?" Viper continued. Emboldened by Tom's apparent passivity, "You were some kind of big shot over in the desert, telling other soldiers what to do. Look at you now, broken, forgotten, useless." He leaned down close to Tom's ear, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried clearly in the silent room. "I bet your buddies who didn't make it home would be real disappointed to see what you've become." That crossed a line that even Tom's legendary patience couldn't tolerate. The mention of fallen comrades, brothers in arms who had died serving their country, struck at the core of everything he held sacred. His hands stilled on his coffee cup, and for the first time since the bikers had entered the saloon, his mask of calm indifference slipped just slightly. The ranchers at the bar noticed the change immediately. Something in Tom's posture had shifted, like a coiled spring suddenly coming under tension. Betty, who had been serving Tom coffee for months, recognized that his usual gentle demeanor had been replaced by something much more dangerous. "That's what I thought," Viper said, misreading Tom's stillness as defeat. "All you military types are the same. Tough talk until someone calls your bluff. Now you're just another broken-down has-been living on government handouts and war stories nobody wants to hear." Tom's coffee cup made a soft clink as he set it down on the table with deliberate precision. His movements were slow and controlled, but there was something in his body language that made the hair on the back of Viper's neck stand up. For just a moment, the biker felt like he was being studied by something predatory. "You know," Tom said conversationally, his voice carrying across the silent saloon, "I've met a lot of men like you over the years, in training camps, in foreign countries and places where the rules of civilization don't apply." He looked up at Viper with eyes that seemed to see straight through him. "Funny thing about bullies is that they're all the same underneath. They pick on people they think can't fight back because they're too scared to face anyone who might actually be dangerous." Viper's face flushed red at the implied challenge. "Calling me scared, Cripple? You think your tough guy act impresses anyone? You can barely walk without that stick, and you want to talk about dangerous." He gestured dismissively at Tom's seated position. "Stand up and say that to my face, if you can manage it." The entire saloon held its breath. Even the children seemed to sense that something important was about to happen. Betty found herself gripping the edge of the bar, her knuckles white with tension. The ranchers slowly turned their bodies toward the confrontation, their instincts telling them that the situation was about to escalate beyond words. Tom looked around the room, taking in the faces of people who had become his neighbors and friends. He saw fear in their eyes, but also something else, a quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, the quiet man they had come to respect might not be as helpless as he appeared. "You boys might want to reconsider your approach," Tom said finally, his voice as steady as steel. The words were spoken quietly, but they carried the weight of absolute conviction. "This town has good people who don't deserve to be threatened by men like you." The bikers erupted in laughter at what they perceived as empty bravado from a disabled man. They had no idea that they were looking at a weapon that had been forged in the crucible of war and tempered by 20 years of lethal service to his country. Tom Wade wasn't just a broken veteran sitting in the corner. He was a sleeping giant who had just been awakened by men too stupid to recognize the danger they had stumbled into. The laughter died in Viper's throat when he saw Tom's expression change. Criminal take an involuntary step backward. Tom's eyes, which had seemed tired and defeated moments before, now held the cold focus of a predator that had been pushed too far. "Last chance," Tom said quietly, his voice carrying a tone that made everyone in the saloon stop breathing. "Walk away. Take your friends and leave these good people alone. Nobody has to get hurt tonight." "You threatening me, Gimp?" he snarled, his hand moving instinctively toward the large knife on his belt. "I'm going to teach you some respect, old man. It's time to show this whole town what happens to cripples who don't know their place." The knife cleared its sheath with a metallic whisper, the blade gleaming under the saloon's warm lights. Instead, He found himself looking into the calm gaze of someone who had faced death more times than he could count. Tom moved. 20 years of Marine. Chorus training exploded into action as Tom rose from his chair with fluid grace that defied everything the room had believed about his disability. His left leg, which everyone thought was permanently damaged, supported his weight perfectly as he stepped forward. In one smooth motion that took less than a second, Tom's right hand shot out and struck Viper's wrist with surgical precision. The knife went flying across the room, clattering harmlessly under a table as Viper stumbled backward, clutching his suddenly numb hand. His mouth opened in shock as he stared at the man who had just moved faster than his eyes could follow. This wasn't the broken veteran he had been tormenting. This was something entirely different. What the hell? One of Viper's companions shouted, reaching for his own weapon. But Tom was already moving again, his body flowing like water as he sidestepped the man's clumsy grab and delivered a precise strike to his solar plexus. The biker doubled over, gasping for air that wouldn't come to his lungs. Chaos erupted in Miller's Creek Saloon as the remaining bikers scrambled to understand what was happening. The man they had dismissed as harmless was dismantling their group with movements that seemed almost choreographed in their efficiency. Tables and chairs scraped against the floor as innocent people dove for cover. But Tom moved through the confusion like he was dancing to music only he could hear. "Get down," Tom called out to the civilians, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed in dangerous situations. The Peterson family immediately dropped behind their overturned table, shielding their children from the violence erupting around them. Betty ducked behind the bar, her hands shaking as she reached for the phone to call for help. The third biker managed to pull a small pistol from his jacket, but Tom had already spotted the weapon and adjusted his position. Accordingly, years of combat experience had taught him to read body language like a book, and he could see the man's intention before the gun was even fully drawn. Tom's cane, which had been lying forgotten on the floor, suddenly appeared in his hand as he rolled behind an overturned table. "Shoot him," Viper screamed, his voice cracking with a combination of pain and disbelief. "Shoot the crazy old man." The gunshot was deafeningly loud in the enclosed space of the saloon. Wood splinters exploded from the table that was shielding Tom, but he was already moving again. The biker fired twice more, his shots going wide as panic affected his aim. Tom emerged from behind a different table, closing the distance between them with the silent efficiency of a hunting cat. The cane moved in a perfect arc, striking the gunman's wrist with enough force to shatter bone. The pistol fell from nerveless fingers as the man screamed in agony. Tom followed through with an elbow strike that sent the biker crashing into the wall, where he slumped unconscious to the floor. "This ain't possible," gasped the fourth member of the group, a wiry man with tattoos covering his neck. He had pulled out a switchblade but seemed frozen by the impossibility of what he was witnessing. The disabled veteran they had been mocking was moving through their group like a force of nature. Leaving unconscious or injured men in his wake, Tom turned toward him with the patient look of a teacher about to deliver a lesson. "Drop the knife," he said calmly, as if they were having a conversation about the weather. "You don't want to make this worse for yourself." Instead of complying, the man lunged forward with his blade extended, desperation overriding common sense. Tom sidestepped the attack effortlessly, grabbed the man's wrist, and used his own momentum against him. The biker found himself airborne for a brief moment before crashing into a pile of chairs with a sound like breaking kindling. Through it all, Tom's breathing remained steady and controlled. His movements were economical, wasting no energy on flashy techniques or unnecessary violence. Each action served a specific purpose, to neutralize threats while minimizing harm to innocent bystanders. It was the difference between a brawler and a warrior, between someone who fought for dominance and someone who fought to protect. Viper, still clutching his injured wrist, stared in horror at his fallen companions. For men who had terrorized, towns across 3 states lay scattered around the saloon like broken toys. The man responsible for their defeat stood calmly in the center of the room, not even breathing hard from the exertion. "Who are you?" Viper whispered, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. He was looking at Tom as if seeing him for the first time, finally understanding that he had made a terrible miscalculation. "I'm exactly who I said I was," Tom replied, his voice returning to the gentle tone the townspeople recognized. "I'm a man who came here looking for peace, a man who wanted to live quietly among good people and cause no trouble for anyone." He took a step toward Viper, who flinched backward. "But I'm also a man who spent 20 years learning how to deal with bullies who prey on innocent folks." The saloon was eerily quiet except for the groans of injured bikers and the muffled sobs of frightened children. Broken furniture and scattered belongings told the story of violence that had erupted and ended in less than 3 minutes. Yet somehow, despite the chaos, not a single innocent person had been harmed. Betty's head appeared cautiously above the bar, her eyes wide with amazement as she took in the scene. The 3 ranchers slowly emerged from their hiding spots, staring at Tom with a mixture of awe and newfound respect. The Peterson family remained huddled behind their table, but Mr. Peterson was peeking over the edge with the expression of someone witnessing a miracle. Tom walked over to where his cane lay forgotten on the floor and picked it up, resuming the slight limp that everyone in town had become accustomed to seeing. The transformation was remarkable in seconds. He had gone from being a lethal force of nature back to being the quiet, disabled veteran they all knew. "Is everyone okay?" he asked, looking around the room with genuine concern. "Did anyone get hurt?" The question seemed to break the spell that had fallen over the saloon. The man they had pitied, the veteran they had seen as broken and harmless. As Tom helped Betty to her feet, making sure she wasn't injured, the biker leader spotted the pistol that had fallen from his companion's hand. Rage and humiliation burned in his chest as he crawled toward the weapon. His mind focused on one thought: making the man who had destroyed his crew pay for the embarrassment. Tom was helping Betty steady herself when he heard the metallic scrape of metal against wood behind him. His trained instincts kicked in immediately, and he spun around to see Viper crawling across the floor toward the fallen pistol. His face was twisted with rage and desperation, his injured hand leaving a small trail of blood as he dragged himself forward. "Look out!" shouted one of the ranchers from across the room, but Tom had already seen the threat developing. He moved to intercept Viper, but the distance was too great. The biker's fingers closed around the pistol grip just as Tom reached him. "Nobody makes a fool out of me," Viper screamed, rolling onto his back and pointing the weapon at Tom. His hands shook from pain and fury, but at this close range, accuracy wouldn't matter much. "I'm gonna blow your head clean off, you crazy old man." Tom dove sideways just as the pistol barked, the bullet splintering the wooden floor where he had been standing. He rolled behind the bar as Viper fired again, the shot going wide and shattering a mirror on the far wall. Glass rained down on the cowering customers as the sound of gunshots echoed through the small building. "Everybody stay down," Tom called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded men in combat. He could hear Viper struggling to his feet, cursing and breathing heavily. The man was wounded and desperate, which made him even more dangerous than before. From behind the bar, Tom spotted something that made him smile grimly. Mounted on wooden pegs beneath the cash register was an old hunting rifle, probably kept there by the owner for protection against wild animals, or the occasional troublemaker. It was a bolt-action Winchester, well-maintained and loaded, just waiting for someone who knew how to use it properly. "Where are you hiding, hero?" Viper taunted, his voice echoing strangely in the damaged saloon. "Come out and face me like a man, or are you going to hide behind that bar like a scared rabbit?" Tom's hands moved over the rifle with the familiarity of a musician touching his instrument. 20 years of military service had made him intimate with weapons of every description, but rifles had always been his specialty. This particular model was older than what he had used in the Marines, but the principles were exactly the same. "You know what your problem is?" Tom called out, his voice calm despite the deadly situation. He was checking the rifle's action, making sure it was ready to fire. "You think violence is about being loud and scary? You think if you yell loud enough and wave your weapons around, people will just give you what you want." Another shot rang out as Viper fired blindly toward the bar, the bullet embedding itself in the thick wooden counter. Tom didn't even flinch. He had been shot at by experts in places where bullets were as common as raindrops, and Viper's panicked shooting didn't concern him. But real violence, Tom continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone giving a lecture. Real violence. It's quiet, it's precise, it's controlled. He finished his inspection of the rifle and carefully peered around the edge of the bar. Viper was standing near the overturned tables, swinging the pistol back and forth as he tried to locate his target. "Shut up!" Viper screamed, firing another wild shot. "Just shut up and die already." Tom noticed something that made his blood run cold. In his desperation and rage, Viper had positioned himself near where the young waitress from the diner was. Hiding behind an overturned table, she was pressed against the floor, her hands covering her head, completely terrified by the gunfire erupting around her. "You see that girl over there?" Tom called out, his voice hardening. "The one you're standing next to? She's probably 19 years old, working 2 jobs to pay for college. She's never hurt anyone in her life, and she doesn't deserve to be caught up in your tantrum." Viper's eyes followed Tom's words and landed on the cowering waitress. Cruel smile spread across his face as he realized he had found the perfect leverage. "Well, well," he said, reaching down and grabbing the girl by her ponytail. She screamed as he hauled her to her feet, pressing the gun barrel against her temple. "Now we're talking." Viper shouted triumphantly. "Come out from behind that bar. Old man, or this little sweetheart, is going to pay for your heroics." The girl whimpered as he tightened his grip on her hair, her eyes squeezed shut in terror. The saloon fell into absolute silence except for the girl's quiet sobs. Even the children had stopped crying, sensing that something terrible was about to happen. Betty clutched the phone she had been using to call for help, her knuckles white as she whispered prayers under her breath. Tom stood up slowly from behind the bar, the rifle held loosely in his hands. His face showed no emotion, but his eyes held a coldness that made several people shiver despite the warm evening air. "Let her go," he said simply. "This is between you and me." "Oh, I don't think so," Viper laughed, but there was a nervous edge to his voice now. Something about Tom's demeanor had changed again, becoming even more focused and dangerous than before. "You want to play hero? Fine, drop that rifle and walk over here with your hands up. Do it now or I paint the wall with this girl's brains." "You know," Tom said conversationally, as if they were discussing the weather, "I've been in situations like this before. Hostage situations in places where the rules of engagement were very different than they are here." He shouldered the rifle, with movements so smooth they seemed rehearsed. "The thing about hostage takers is that they always make the same mistake." "What mistake?" Viper demanded, pressing the gun harder against the girl's head. "I'm the one holding the cards here. They think the hostage gives them power," Tom replied, his eye finding the rifle's scope. "But what it really does is limit their options. See, when you grab an innocent person, you stop being a threat and start being a target.
Ow.
And I've spent 20 years learning how to eliminate targets." The rifle was old, but well-maintained, its scope still perfectly calibrated. Tom had made shots at distances measured in hundreds of yards, in weather conditions that would have challenged a meteorologist, against enemies who were specifically trained to avoid being shot. This situation, 20 feet of distance in a well-lit room against a stationary target, was almost embarrassingly easy by comparison. "You're bluffing," Viper shouted, but uncertainty crept into his voice. "You shoot and you might hit the girl. No way you take that risk." "Actually," Tom said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "I'm Gunnery Sergeant Thomas Wade, United States Marine Corps, retired, confirmed sniper with 237 kills, Medal of Honor recipient. The girl is going to duck on my count of 3. The young waitress, despite her terror, seemed to understand that her life depended on following Tom's instructions. She gave the slightest nod to show she was listening. "You're crazy," Viper screamed, but Tom could see the fear growing in his eyes. "You can't make that shot. Nobody's that good." "1," Tom said calmly, his breathing slowing to the rhythm he had practiced 10,000 times on shooting ranges around the world. "Stop counting." Viper's hand shook as he tried to decide whether to shoot Tom or the girl first. 2, Tom continued, his finger finding the trigger with the familiarity of a handshake between old friends. The girl tensed, ready to drop to the floor the moment Tom said 3. Around the room, people held their breath as they witnessed what felt like a standoff between life and death itself. 3. The waitress dropped like a stone, and Tom's rifle spoke with the authority of absolute precision. The shot was perfect, a testament to decades of training and natural talent refined to its highest possible level. Viper's pistol flew from his suddenly nerveless fingers as he stumbled backward, his shoulder wounded but his life spared. In the distance, sirens wailed as police cars raced toward the saloon, finally responding to Betty's frantic phone calls. But the crisis was over. The man who had terrorized the peaceful town lay on the floor, defeated by someone he had dismissed as helpless. Tom lowered the rifle and walked over to help the shaken waitress to her feet. "You did good," he told her gently. "It's over now. You're safe." As paramedics and police officers flooded into Miller's Creek Saloon, the townspeople of Millerville finally learned the truth about their quiet neighbor. Tom Wade wasn't just a broken veteran trying to find peace. He was a legend. A warrior whose skills and courage had protected them when they needed it most. But more importantly, he was exactly what he had always claimed to be, a good man who wanted nothing more than to live peacefully among good people, and who would do whatever it took to protect the community that had welcomed him home.